Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning as we discuss what we need to know about patents. So we're going to start off with a brief explanation of who we are, discuss our purpose for today and the agenda. Then I'll introduce our guests. I will ask you, I know everyone has already muted their mics, but just a reminder, if you can keep your mics muted unless you're talking or you have a question. And if you do have a question in the middle of a discussion, feel free to put that in the chat window. We'll be looking at that as well. So my name is Kim Mozingo, and I am with the Maryland Defense Technology Commercialization Center. That is a program of the Maryland Department of Commerce funded by the Federal Economic Development Administration. And what we do, also this morning, Griffin St. Louis and Gary Evans are here from DefTech. Gary is the executive director, Griffin is the program manager, and they're both going to be speaking to us this morning. So what we do is look for businesses that are looking for a technology solution, and we connect them with the DoD labs in the state of Maryland. In a nutshell, that's what we do. But you'll learn more as we go through the morning about what we do and how we help businesses commercialize technology. So our goal for today then is to help companies acquire the knowledge that they need to reduce risk in licensing intellectual property. After you decide that you're going to license the technology, as I mentioned before, the lab that you're licensing from is going to want to know that you're prepared to take that technology to market, and will expect you to demonstrate that with a strong commercialization plan. DefTech connects businesses to the resources that are available in the DoD labs in Maryland. And much of our work is focused on helping companies and technology transfer professionals engage in mutually beneficial relationships, ones that help the companies grow their business and helps the DoD to meet their mission-driven needs. DefTech supports companies through the entire commercialization pipeline, from searching for the right intellectual property solution to connecting them to resources that they need, to connection with the labs, and ultimately the final technology transfer agreement, which would be a patent license agreement or a cooperative research and development agreement. As we pointed out, learning as much as possible prior to licensing is key to reducing your risk, your business risk. We help companies connect with the tech transfer professionals who will bring the inventor into the conversation so the company can have their technical questions answered. Once a company makes that decision, they've done their due diligence and they decide that licensing a particular piece of technology makes sense for them, and the lab agrees, the next step in preparing to license is developing a commercialization plan. So while commercialization plans are requirements for licensing, and there is a fairly standard template that the DoD uses for their expectations, they also serve as a working document for the company. You use them as a guide to planning your commercialization path, and then use that as you're working through the entire process to keep yourself on track. Today, we're going to speak with Dr. Gary Evans. He's the executive director of DefTech, who in his career has written and reviewed too many commercialization plans to count, I believe. Thanks for being here, Gary.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
So let's set aside the idea of preparing a commercialization plan simply to check a block with the tech transfer office, and talk about them more as you've used them, which is an actual tool to help drive a really successful product development process. So what are some of the questions that a commercialization plan should answer for a company?
So the purpose of the commercialization plan is exactly what it says. It's there to give you a clear pathway and a clear roadmap for exactly what it is you need to do to take the technology from its nascent form into an actual product that you can put on the market. And although we're talking about this in the context of patents, the same thing is actually true in a business if you have an internal R&D function and some new technology is being developed internally. You still essentially need to do the same kind of things. And one of the first things that's really important to do is actually validate whether what's reported in the patent is something you can actually replicate. You would think that necessarily what's in the patent must be doable, And essentially it is, but patents don't necessarily include absolutely all of the information. The material in the patent may represent a very small set of experiments, and it's extremely unwise to embark on a whole product development program if you can't actually just replicate what you think you're starting with. And depending on the nature of the invention and the nature of your business, that may be a relatively quick thing to do, or it may take much longer. If it's a bioscience application, it could take months or even years just to establish whether the patent is really valid in your terms. And one thing you can do to address that is to, if it is a patent that you're looking to license, you can negotiate with the patent owner for some kind of option where you can say, okay, we need to validate that this does actually do what it says it does, and we want some kind of fixed time period in which we can do that. During that time, you won't license it to anyone else, although there's a lot of variations on that. The second thing you need to do is to explore whether it really does do what you want. And that may involve carrying out additional work, additional experiments, additional tests, even if it does what the patent says, just to establish, yeah, this really will meet the need that we think we have. And then, assuming those things come through with a green light, then you really have to get into the detailed planning of how are we actually going to do this? How are we going to take this thing, incorporate it into a product, or develop a new product around it, all the way through to having that thing on the market? And Kim mentioned that the DoD in particular, but other organizations as well, have a kind of template for a commercialization plan, which is at a relatively high level. If you're going to do this in real life, so to speak, what you need is a lot of detail. There's lots of questions you have to ask. And obviously on day one, you may not be able to answer all of them, but answering them as much as you can in whatever level of detail you can as you go forward is essential to having a meaningful product development process, because your two biggest enemies are time and money. If you don't do things quickly enough, you can miss a market opportunity, and you can run out of money. And obviously, everybody works with a finite amount of money. So a good plan is essential to being successful in this.
So you talked about this as not just a check the block for tech transfer and some of the detail that needs to go into this. And of course, any company that's looking at commercializing something, they're savvy. These are smart people. We know that because we talked about the process that we go through to help drive success, to make sure that they're as capable of doing this as possible. Can you go into, Gary, some of the things that people need to think about? We could share your slide. I think that's a great slide.
Okay, so the slide is relatively simple. The circle on the right just describes some of the core things that you need to think about when you're developing a product. And you'll see it's divided into three. There's market. And Cyrus talked a lot about, understanding what the market need is, and you'll see that pursued in depth through programs like the ICO program and other accelerators, and I'm not going to focus on that. Cyrus also talked about the actual product development piece of it, but one of the purposes of this diagram is to emphasize that slice that people think of as product development isn't actually the whole story. You have to think about the entire life of the product, from that first idea all the way through to, well, we're going to have a product that we're selling to people. And so a big piece of that it's important to think about early on is the chunk which is in that circle under operations. And particularly, I want to focus on a few things in that. So what you have to think about, particularly if you're talking about a technically sophisticated product, is what do we need to do for quality assurance and quality control? If we're going to be producing this thing, have we produced something like this before? What volumes are we going to be producing in? Do we need to develop new QA and QC processes that are relevant to this particular technology or this particular type of product? Do we even have to acquire new equipment that are that's going to allow us to actually do the necessary testing? And of course, in a lot of technically focused markets, there are regulatory requirements as well, and you may have to build those into the QA and QC side of things. So you're obviously not going to do all of that, develop all of that on day one, but if you don't have those things in mind, don't have an understanding of how you're going to address those things, what will happen is that as you go through the process, you'll end up spending more time and more money through not having given sufficient thought at the beginning. The same thing is true of supply chain questions. It's very unlikely, particularly these days, that anybody is going to develop literally an entire product in-house. Companies are getting smaller and more specialized. It's much easier to operate even global supply chains these days. And so you have to think about, okay, what are all the pieces, all the components, all the parts that we're going to need to have on an ongoing basis to develop this thing, and where are we going to get them? And if we want a reliable supply chain, we really need to build in redundancy. So how are we going to do that? What's the timing? You know, with a lot of electronic components, for example, depending on how specialized they are, you may find that a supplier says, yeah, we can give you this volume. And you say, well, we want this volume. And they say, well, that's going to have a lead time of 3 months. And similarly with something like injection molding. If you work with an injection molding company, they have their own workflow, they have their own customers, and you can't usually just go to them and say, oh, look, I want this thing and I want you to make it and I need it really quickly. You may find that you have to wait weeks or even months just to get an initial piece manufactured that you can look at and you can test. And a lot of the molds that are involved in injection molding themselves take time to make. And so you just have to map these things out in your mind and on paper and flag out, these are things we think we're going to need to address. Distribution is another one. You know, you may have an existing distribution network or you may not. Your new product might require a different distribution network. And, you know, will there be something in there that requires special handling or special treatment or, you know, particularly unusual shipping requirements, which may be the case, for example, with a lot of biological products. And last but not least, how are we going to do customer support? You know, everybody has experienced customer support, whether it's from your local DIY store to a software product, all the way through to some more sophisticated technical product. The customer support piece is all part of the picture. And if you get all the way through your product development and you still haven't figured out how you're going to do that, again, it's going to cost you time and money, and it will certainly add additional risk to the project, and it can actually result in, you know, significant lags, which impact on the viability of the entire thing. So what I would say is, for the commercialization plan, think about all of these things, but don't just think about the obvious ones, and really go through a process internally with your team or in your own mind and just step through it and think, what do we really need here? And when are we going to need it? Because a lot of these things will have to happen in parallel. They'll intersect, they'll split apart, they'll combine with each other, and you really have to have an understanding about how it's all going to fit together. And as Kim said, that really goes into a much, much deeper level of detail than what most people normally think of as a commercialization plan in the context of a license agreement.
Thank you, Gary. I think thinking things through with the end in mind, and kind of working backwards and thinking of the whole process, the whole kind of ecosystem that you're working in to develop a product is critically important. And this provides a little more rigor than the information that is required by the tech transfer labs. So from their perspective, we can think about them wanting to reduce their risk. So this commercialization plan will help a business reduce risk. because it forces thinking through the entire process. From the perspective of the lab that might be agreeing to a license with you, they want to know that you're going to be able to successfully commercialize their intellectual property, that they're, and likely this is going to be, it's a partnership. So they're going to want to make sure that you're successful, and you're going to want to make sure that they're successful, and that means you'll be successful. So this is more detailed than what is required, but it's well worth the effort. And I think Gary made that very, very clear. There's also...
Yeah, I think if I could just add to that one other thing, Kim, as well, which is often hugely unpopular, but it's really valuable, is all of this stuff is much, much easier if you have a formal quality management system. And when people think about quality management systems, they usually don't think about it in a positive sense. But mostly that's because they've experienced bad quality management systems. All a quality management system does is make sure that you figure out in advance what you're going to do and that you do actually do it. And in some industries, like medical device industry, there is a specific ISO quality management standard which you can follow. And there's even software which will help you manage that. But even if you're not doing something that complex, just having a quality management system in place will make the entire process much easier. And if you've never been involved with one, can be a little bit of a learning curve, but it's really not that complex and it's really not that difficult to do. So that's my little pitch on QMS, and I'll stop now.
Thank you. It's important, and it's thank you for sharing that, because your perspective, you've done this before and you know what works because you've not just done it one time, you've done it repeatedly. So thank you for sharing that with everyone. One of the things I want to point out is if you're licensing from a DoD lab, there are a few additional sections that they'll want to see in a plan that you maybe wouldn't create if you were just creating something in-house, a plan just to work from in-house. They'll want to know about your, if you have any small business certifications, any type of certifications that you have. They're going to want to know what their role is in your commercialization plan. What's the role of the lab? What are your expectations for them? And then they're going to ask for your proposed licensing and royalty fees. You can put that out on the table first. You can put that out in your commercialization plan. In fact, you're expected to do that. And so with that, next week, we're going to be, or 2 weeks from now, we're going to be talking about how you negotiate a license agreement. Clearly, licensing isn't something that anyone undertakes lightly. It takes a lot of thought and consideration. You need to know your company well. You really need to have a good manufacturing partners or other partners. As Cyrus pointed out, if you don't have it in-house, partner with someone. But once you've made that decision to license, it can be challenging to figure out, how do you propose fees in your plan, and then how do you negotiate for that license? So we are going to talk about that on June 16th, same time, same location, different link, but the same location. So let's return just for a moment to the topic of what DefTech is and why the Maryland Department of Commerce set this program up. Our purpose is to help businesses make use of the extraordinary lab resources that are available in the state of Maryland, particularly the DoD labs. But Maryland we're home to 78 federal labs. That's more than any other state. And most of those state-of-the-art facilities, the highly sought-after expertise, the cutting-edge intellectual property that's available, it's available to help businesses grow. They're not getting patents just for the heck of it. They're getting patents, and business gets to license those patents and use them. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. I apologize for the technical glitches. If there are specific topics that you'd like to see us cover, you can add them to the chat now, or you can email us, info@deftechmd.com. And we will see you back here, hopefully in 2 weeks. In the meantime, let's all look out for each other, respect each other. Let's stay home and stay safe. Wear your masks when you're out and wash your hands. Thank you.